Harold Stevens has worked at the same slaughterhouse for many years and was Mr. Eric Dalton's best employee. Harold never complained about the searing heat or freezing cold of the substandard shack he worked in, nor did he complain about the back-breaking hard work for minimal pay. He didn't even complain when the pay was being cut, forcing him to work overtime to make ends meet. But everyone has a breaking point, and Harold was about to reach his. You see, Mr. Dalton was an incredibly dishonest man from the very start of his life. He cheated his way through school, cheated his way to get a degree in business, and cheated the poor farmers out of their livestock for measly pay. Mr. Dalton had everything a man could ask for: money, power, fame, everything except for one thing. One thing he couldn't have. One thing that money couldn't buy. Harold's wife, Mrs. Ashley Stevens. Mr. Dalton had his sights set on Mrs. Stevens from the first time he had seen her, when she had surprised Harold with a homemade lunch. Dalton set his plan in motion days later, increasing Harold's hours to ridiculous, unethical hours, as well as making his work even more tedious and backbreaking by increasing his quota of cuts he needed to make an hour to a near impossible rate. And while Harold toiled away, Dalton would harass Harold's wife, becoming more and more forward and insistent as time went on. Ashley eventually told Harold of the constant harassment she was receiving and how the police were doing nothing, which she highly suspected they were paid off to ignore any calls made by her. After hearing this, Harold quietly excuses himself from the table at which they were sitting and stood outside, pondering under the stars. Harold was a very rational man. He never acted on the thoughts of a knee-jerk reaction. He always took time to think things through and executed whatever the appropriate action was in his mind with a level head. So that's why the next day, when Mr. Dalton approached him, ordering him to leave his wife and allow him to marry her, or he would make sure that his life was the closest thing to a living hell he could make it, Harold took the meat hook he was cleaning and thrust it into Mr. Dalton's throat. Harold then calmly hoisted Dalton up with the pigs he had already hung up for the day, despite Mr. Dalton's gurgled protests. What happened in the next few minutes is a testament to why you should never push a man too far over the edge. Harold cut Mr. Dalton into pieces. He had plenty of practice from all the animals he had cut before. After the meat was taken care of, Harold ground the bones and mixed them into the grain for the chickens. That night, after Harold came home from the slaughterhouse weary, the police were questioning his wife about a missing person. Ashley and Harold answered every question they could for the police. They even ate dinner together. After Harold and his beloved were cleared of any suspicion, the officers asked if they could take the remainder of the steak home to the station for the rest of the hungry officers. Mrs. Stevens kindly obliged. "Thank you kindly, Mrs. Stevens. The steak was simply amazing. May I ask where you got the cuts?" they said, smiling as Mrs. Stevens wrapped the steak up in tinfoil. "Just some special cuts my husband brought home from a long day of work," she replied. Later, Dalton was declared dead, and his assets were up in the air for a long time. He had no living family members or anyone he knew willing to take over the business. It stood to reason to the people in charge of transferring assets that it should go to the most qualified employee who, as mentioned before, was Harold. Harold ran the slaughterhouse fairly, giving his workers time off, reasonable hours, and even found more humane ways of killing the animals. Nobody ever found out about what Harold and his wife had done. They lived the rest of their lives in prosperity and happiness. However, they say, in the early morning, before the rooster even crows, in the abandoned shed that used to be part of the slaughterhouse, abandoned in favor for a massive, much nicer complex, you may hear a sinister laughter. A laughter that could only be coming from a madman reveling in something he enjoyed far too much.